So, happy Doctor Who Day, belatedly, to those of you who celebrate. Davros has been in the news, hasn't he? There was a Children in Need sketchlet featuring returning Dr. David Tennant, and indeed incumbent Davros, Julian Bleach, playing an evidently as yet unmutilated and uncrippled Davros, without the hideous scarring makeup and without the wheelchair, just an evil scientist in a Nazi uniform. This was further elaborated upon by returning showrunner Russell T Davies, who said that he chose to depict this Davros because he finds himself increasingly uncomfortable in the modern era with the whole crippled evil genius trope. And I kind of know what he means, and I really don't think this is this big a deal. If this is the only version of Davros we're going to see from now on, if we see him from before the creation of the Daleks, then, yep, that's what he looked like before whatever happened to him happened. And if we want to see him from later on in the timeline, then we can just have one line of dialogue that he cloned himself a new body. That's it, taken care of, really doesn't matter. There's a hell of a lot of hand-wringing and bedwetting going on about this, which is really unnecessary. But those of you who've been following me around for a while will know that I actually did a video about Davros a good few years ago, in which I expressed my opinion that Davros should never have been brought back after his first story anyway. Now, if you want to know why, go and watch that video. Apologies in advance, it's a bit long-winded. But thinking about Davros as an example of a great bad guy who should not have been brought back, they're going to be thinking, what about the other way around? What about those great Doctor Who bad guys that we only ever met the once, who we could maybe do with seeing again? So here are 5 great one-off Doctor Who bad guys. Now, before we go on, you will notice that all 5 of these come from what you might call the classic era of the show, the pre-cancellation 1963 to 1989 run. This was not like a conscious decision on my part. It's just that as I thought about it, I realised that the fact that the show, since it came back, tends to do these season-long story arcs, with which a couple of exceptions the old show didn't do, means that it's quite unusual for there to be an actual one-off bad guy in the new show. Pretty much everybody comes back sooner or later. So in no particular order, we will start with Azal from The Demons, 1971. Now, this is an example of Doctor Who being both kind of ahead of its time and absolutely of its time. On the one hand, The Demons successfully anticipates that creepy, rural folk horror atmosphere of The Wicker Man by a couple of years. On the other hand, Azal himself is a classic example of your post-Eric von Daniken, what if ancient civilizations was all done by aliens trope. And also because Azal happens to be a big hairy giant with horns and cloven hooves, his presence on Earth, albeit a dormant, buried presence on Earth, is responsible for our similarly buried race memories of what we think the devil looks like. An idea which they in no way nick from Quatermass in the Pit. But there's a couple of reasons why it's maybe surprising that we never saw them again. First of all, he's quite nicely rendered. The performance by Stephen Thorne, giving us the first of many shouty overlords that he would bring to the old show. Also, they're just quite an interesting idea. These incalculably ancient interplanetary bioengineers who go around shaping civilizations. I mean, Ridley Scott was still doing that one in Prometheus in 2012. But also, given that the story gives us to understand that they are in some way responsible for the development of most of the advanced civilizations of the universe, it's just kind of surprising that we never heard of them again. Next up, we have the Wurn from 1975's The Ark in Space. The reason I always want to see the Wurn again is just I'd like to see them done better. They were a great idea, but the effects and model technology didn't really exist at the time to render them convincingly. They're pretty much a race of 6-foot wasps. Now, the costumes, as always, look great, but essentially what you've got is a kind of sleeping bag with a kind of insect thorax stuck on the top of it. So the Wurn are pretty much the only insects in the universe who kind of have all 6 limbs dangling in front of them while they bounce along on their arse. Now, of course, we did briefly get a glimpse of a big, rather convincingly rendered CG wasp in the Agatha Christie story back in the David Tennant era. I guess I should say the first David Tennant era. So while the Wurn are a nice idea with a proper element of body horror, they're these sort of parasitic insects who lay their eggs inside people, the way they were depicted on screen left a bit to be desired, and I'd like to see the show take another pass at them. Okay, next up, and I think this is going to surprise some of you, the Pteroleptils from 1982's The Visitation. Now, the Pteroleptils, unlike the Wurn, actually were quite convincingly depicted on screen. In particular, the mask worn by the actor playing the principal Pteroleptil, because I think you get to meet 3 of them, has some pretty effective early animatronics in it to give it a degree of expression while it talks, rather than sort of just doing that, which alien faces tended to do back in the 70s and 80s. What's interesting about the pteroleptals is not so much that they look cool, although they do look cool, they're a bit like kind of land-going piranha fish, is there are hints at an interesting and diverse culture. First of all, unusually, the bad guy pteroleptals that we meet are actual bad guy pteroleptals. They're not invading Earth on behalf of the pteroleptal empire. They are criminal fugitive pteroleptals hiding out on 17th century Earth from their own people. Now that's a pretty novel idea that didn't come up in Doctor Who very much then or indeed now. Also, the Doctor has one throwaway line of, "I've never been able to reconcile the pteroleptals' love of art and beauty with their love of war." So again, hinting at a kind of a rich and diverse culture that I think it would be quite fun to get a look at. Next up we have the Kinoid from 1976's Seeds of Doom. This is an interesting story. On the one hand, it's a slight knockoff of the 1951 movie The Thing, although interestingly, it actually sticks more closely to the source material of the 1951 movie, which is a short story by John W. Campbell called Who Goes There? In that, it's about a bunch of human scientists who thaw out an alien nasty at a polar station. But unlike in the 1951 movie, it's not just a monster that then runs riot and starts killing people. It's actually a sort of biological entity that starts to absorb and take over the human scientists. Which you'll recall is what happens in John Carpenter's ostensible remake of The Thing, which came out 5 years later. Now, I'm not suggesting that John Carpenter got the idea of remaking The Thing but hopping over it and going back to the source material from Doctor Who. I think they just kind of had the same idea. But again, this is a neat idea and very well rendered for its day. I actually rewatched this whole story recently and it's bloody good. The Kinoid is a plant being. What is thawed from the ice is just a kind of seed pod about the size of a cricket ball, but once thawed it lashes out tendrils and starts injecting people with Kinoid juice, and they start to slowly mutate into plant creatures. And this is depicted really rather grotesquely. The human scientist in particular is conscious and in agony as his skin slowly turns into, well, bark. But eventually, of course, it takes over his brain as well, and the Kinoid first of all becomes a sort of vaguely humanoid pile of tendrils, and then extends into just this massive building-sized thingy, which then starts to telepathically control all the plants in the region. So you have great scenes of people being attacked by trees and vines. Its ultimate goal, of course, being to destroy all animal life and unite all plant life on the planet and rule over this entirely green world. Now, I think a fun way to bring the Kinoid back would be to visit a planet where this has already happened. You know, on the one hand, the Doctor and his companions find themselves in this incredibly lush and verdant planet that seems to be utterly at peace, before realizing that the reason it is at peace is because the plants gained sentience and ate all the people, and that their presence has been noted and is in no way welcome. Now that's a pretty good kick-off for a story right there, isn't it? Probably should have kept that to myself, actually. Oh, and while we're here, the human bad guy in Seeds of Doom, a sort of Bond villain botanist called Harrison Chase, played by Tony Beckley, who starts to collaborate with the Kinoid and sabotage any attempts to contain it, is one of the best human bad guys in all of Doctor Who. But if you've seen the story, he's not coming back anytime soon. Okay, last up, I'm from 1975, actually earlier in the same season as Seeds of Doom, season 13, very possibly the best series of Doctor Who of all time. We have Sutekh from Pyramids of Mars. Now again, what you have with Sutekh is a neat idea, well rendered. Pyramids of Mars, if you haven't seen it, and you really should, is a classic example of what Doctor Who was doing in the mid-70s, which was essentially doing knockoffs of Hammer movies for 8-year-olds. So elsewhere in this same season, like I say, amazing season, we have The Brain of Morbius, which is essentially Doctor Who does Frankenstein. And Pyramids of Mars is absolutely Doctor Who does The Mummy. But the idea behind all these kind of mid-70s Doctor Who horror movie stories is that you have horror movie meat on science fiction bones. So while in this story you absolutely have mummies, as in lumbering, bandaged figures menacing humans, they are not, in this instance, the reanimated corpses of people cursed by the Egyptian gods. They are in fact the robot manservants of the godlike aliens worshipped by the ancient Egyptians. Because we're kind of back in Von Daniken territory, and why the hell not if it gets the story to work. And Sutekh is the big bad. He is the outcast evil Osiran imprisoned upon Mars and trying to manipulate events on Earth in the 1920s to facilitate his escape. Now, I almost didn't include Sutek because there is a hint that he might actually sort of been back already. You see, much as Azal is meant to be the source of our race memory of what the devil is supposed to look like, there is a hint that Sutek is responsible for our race memory of who the devil actually is. At one point, the Doctor rattles off a bunch of names by which Sutek has been known over the centuries. One of them is Satan. And that is kind of how he features in his own personal legend. He is a junior god, or possibly senior angel, who has rebelled and turned to evil and has been cast out by the big boss god. Now, you may recall that some 30 years later in the David Tennant story, The Impossible Planet / the Satan Pit, we encounter an entity which may or may not be the devil imprisoned on a planet orbiting a black hole. And as is often the way in Doctor Who, the human scientists who are investigating this find themselves being slowly taken over by this evil psychic entity. Now, the actor who plays Sutek is a guy called Gabriel Wolfe, and unlike the sort of shouty overlords essayed by Stephen Thorne, he instead goes for silkily, quietly menacing. And it's a wonderful vocal performance. Now, when, in The Impossible Planet / the Satan Pit, the human crew of the spaceship investigating the planet orbiting the black hole find themselves being taken over by some weird psychic entity, the voice they hear in their heads is that same actor, Gabriel Wolfe. So while it's not necessarily suggesting that Sutek imprisoned upon Mars and this big roaring demon thing imprisoned around a black hole are the same being, I think it's more a question of Russell T and pals thinking, that was a really cool voice that the devil character had in Pyramids of Mars. Let's get that guy back. So there you have 5 one-off Doctor Who bad guys I wouldn't mind seeing again. I'm sure you've already thought of a couple. Into the comments they go. And yeah, I guess I'll see you all for the 70th anniversary, which, given how fast the 10 years since the 50th anniversary seems to have gone, will be in about 6 weeks' time.
Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit like and share. If you'd like to see more, please hit subscribe. And if you'd like to help me make more, please visit patreon.com/MitchBenn.